All right, so thank you guys for joining me tonight. We're going to be talking about 5 common antibacterial agents and their relative effectiveness. The reason that I wanted to have this conversation was because of a story that I heard from my grandparents who are on this call with us about my uncle who went and bought 2 gallons of hand sanitizer off of Amazon for $120 and has since gone on to learn how to make hand sanitizer himself. This is something that we're seeing a lot of right now. A lot of people are buying out all of the hand sanitizer, they're stocking up on soaps. Everybody wants to do what's best for themselves and for their family in terms of health during this whole global pandemic. I want to preface this by saying that I'm not an epidemiologist, which means that I am not an expert on communicable diseases or the spread of infectious diseases. I am a biology major at Malone University, and a lot of what I'll be talking about today comes from a lab that I did on January 14th, 2020, under the supervision of Dr. Hope Badaway in our microbiology class. So today I want to discuss 5 common antibacterial agents, as well as their relative effectiveness and what that means for us as consumers. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys so that you can see this fun little PowerPoint that I have put together. So I'm going to take a sip of water here. So to start, I want to talk about how we set up this experiment. I was given a sterile petri dish with a nutrient auger in it. That means that it has a jelly-like substance that has a nitrogen or carbon source in it that a microbacteria would be able to feed off of, use as a nutrient source, and then grow well in this jelly substance. So I drew this line down the middle with a Sharpie, labeled it 1 through 5, before and after. So this 1 through 5 was for each of my 5 fingers. They recommended that we find something germy to touch. I chose my phone. I rubbed my fingers all over my phone like this, made sure to touch things like the power button and volume buttons that I would end up touching a lot during my day. I then rubbed my fingers on the 1 through 5 slots, and then after using the different antibacterial agents, use the same fingers on the after 1 through 5 spots. I'll be talking about these results and what they mean in just a second, but first I'm going to talk about what those agents are, what they do, and how they do it. Oops. So our first agent is triclosan. Triclosan is what you will find in most antibacterial hand soaps. It is a bacteriostatic agent, which means that it will stop the growth of existing bacteria, but won't necessarily kill it. It's also a biocide in high concentration, so it's going to kill most living things. It does this by stopping fatty acid synthesis. So that inhibits a cell's ability to store energy for itself, which will ultimately cause it to kind of exhaust itself to death. Next, we have isopropanol or ethanol. This is what you'll find in an alcohol-based hand sanitizer. It is a bactericidal agent, which means that it will kill the bacteria along with tuberculosis, fungi, and viruses. It does this by denaturing the proteins. And when I say that, I want you to think of when you cook an egg. When you first crack the egg white is that jelly texture, it's clear, and then as it heats, it becomes more opaque white, it gets that rubbery texture to it. And that's because the proteins of the egg are being denatured. So when the alcohol denatures the protein of a cell, it's going to change its shape, it's going to change its function, it's going to make it so that it can't do what it needs to do for the cell to function properly. Next, we have benzalkonium chloride. This is what you'll find in an alcohol-free hand sanitizer. It is a bacteriostatic agent, but it can be bactericidal in high concentrations. It also is able to kill living things, viruses, fungi, and protozoa. It does this by denaturing the proteins, which we just talked about with the alcohol, but it also disrupts the cytoplasmic membranes. That membrane is like the outer shell of a cell. It keeps the good stuff in and the bad stuff out. So disrupting that membrane messes with a cell's ability to regulate itself, and so it won't be able to do what it needs to do, and that will ultimately lead to cell death in a lot of cases. Next, we have povidone iodine. This is what you will use if you have some sort of a surgery and the surgeon cleans the surgical site with iodine before cutting in. It is bactericidal, and it also will kill most fungi, viruses, and protozoa. It does this by iodinizing lipids, which again will mess with a cell's ability to store energy for itself. It also oxidizes the cytoplasmic and membrane compounds, which we talked about before, that will inhibit the cell's ability to regulate itself and will cause problems for the cell. And finally, we have chlorhexidine gluconate. This will be found in something like Hibiclens, which is a antiseptic treatment if you would find it in maybe a first aid kit. It's also a really common ingredient in antiseptic oral rinses. It is a bacteriostatic agent, but can be bactericidal in high concentrations. It also kills fungi, bacterial spores, and protozoa. Something interesting about it is that it prevents biofilms. The biofilm that you would probably be most familiar with is the plaque on your teeth. So that's why it's a really common ingredient in these antiseptic oral rinses, because it keeps that plaque from growing on your teeth. It also works against viruses in vitro. So that means that during the virus's reproductive cycle, it could inhibit its growth, but it might not do anything for a full-fledged bacterial infection once it has started. I'm sorry, viral infection once it has started. And it does this by disrupting the cell membranes. So talking about the results. I want you to look not only at these 1 through 5 compared to each other, but also at their own before versus after for the same fingers. Our first agent was povidone iodine. On this side, we see all of these little bacterial colonies. And then on this side, we see very little growth at all. There's almost nothing there. That means that this was a very effective antibacterial agent. And we want that. If you have a surgery or something like that, you don't want any bacterial in that surgical spot. So it's very good that that behaved the way that it did. Agent number 2 is Purell. It's an alcohol-based hand sanitizer. So here we have these big, thick colonies. On this side, we have still a bunch of colonies that kind of spread their way throughout the plate. And they're these smaller colonies rather than these big, fat ones. And I'll talk about that, what that means in a minute, but I want to get through the rest of the results first. Agent number 3 was our chlorhexidine gluconate. That's what we're going to find in the Hibiclens or the oral antiseptic rinses. So we see these colonies right here. We don't really see any of that over here. It's hard to say these little tiny colonies around the rim here if they came from 3, 4, or 5, but overall this was a very effective agent. And again, you're going to be prescribed those oral antiseptic rinses a lot of time if you have some sort of an oral surgery. So you want to make sure that there's not bacteria getting into those types of wound sites. So it's very good that that behaved the way that it did. Agent number 4 was Dial antibacterial hand soap. That one's main ingredient was triclosan. So we go from these big colonies over here to lots and lots of little tiny colonies. This is actually very concerning, and I will be talking about why in just a second once we get through the rest of these results. Agent number 5 is our benzalkonium chloride. That would be our alcohol-free hand sanitizer. We see that almost nothing was growing around number 5 on the after side, which means that this was a very effective agent. So just from the looks of this dish, the chlorine-based hand sanitizer that has no alcohol in it is actually better at killing the specific bacteria that were on my phone case than the Purell alcohol-based hand sanitizer. So I'm going to get out of here. Oops. Okay. So what does that mean for us as consumers? Well, right now the CDC is recommending that we wash our hands with plain soap and water. They are not recommending any antibacterial soaps, and that's a lot because the FDA currently has some gripes with triclosan. Triclosan was agent number 4. We saw all those little tiny dots that were little tiny bacterial colonies. This is indicative of something called antibacterial resistance. So when something kills 99.9% of germs, those little tiny colonies are coming from the 0.1% that triclosan wasn't capable of killing. That's actually very dangerous because that means that all of the bacteria you see there are stronger than triclosan. So you would need something stronger than that to kill it. And then the 0.1% of those might go on and continue to grow and so on and so forth. That you end up creating these superbugs that are very dangerous, can cause very serious infections that are very hard to fight. So right now they're actually recommending that people step away from products that contain triclosan and that you try to stay with just regular hand soap rather than antibacterial hand soap. We're also seeing that the CDC is recommending in the fight against the coronavirus that people use alcohol-based hand sanitizers that are at least 60% alcohol. In my study that I showed you, agent number 2 was the Purell. We saw the way that it kind of spread throughout the Petri dish. That was actually a 65% alcohol hand sanitizer. So that's actually very concerning because, again, those little tiny colonies indicate some antibacterial resistance, which can be very dangerous. But it also shows us that the hand sanitizer is not a substitute for regular hand washing. So you should be washing your hands with the regular soap and water, washing them thoroughly, making sure you get in all the nooks and crannies. And then if you're out in public and you touch something really grimy and you just need to get that first layer of defense, reach for the hand sanitizer, but you shouldn't be using it instead of hand soap. So today we learned a little bit of microbiology as we talked about these 5 agents and their relative effectiveness and what that means for us as consumers. Remember, you do not need to go out and buy 2 gallons of hand sanitizer, but please be washing your hands, wash them often, and try to be mindful of what you're washing them with.